Welcome to the Howard Jarvis Podcast. My name is John Kupal, and you may tell by the intro that I am not Susan Shelley. Susan Shelley has taken a well-deserved week off. First of all, that is shocking in and of itself because she almost never takes a vacation. She is the busiest, most active person in Southern California, working on behalf of California taxpayers and being our representative for HJTA. Many of you know that Susan is our Vice President of Communications. So she has entrusted me to run the podcast today. She may live to regret it. We don't know. We'll see how that works out. But welcome. And I could not do this solo, so I extended an invitation to a very good friend of mine, who has been involved in many battles in the Capitol and statewide on behalf of free enterprise. I'd like to welcome to the program John Kabatek, who is the California State Director of the National Federation of Independent Business. John, great to see you. How you doing?
Hey, John, it is great to be here. I am doing fantastic, even though I'm sorry I was informed I was going to be on the Susan Shelley show today. But despite that, it is great to be with you, John Kupal.
Yeah, well, you know what? Sometimes you got to let the amateurs get some training. So we'll do this. I'm just the president. For those of you who don't know, I'm the president of the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, California's largest taxpayer organization, founded by the late Howard Jarvis, defending Proposition 13, which we continue to do to this day. And John Kabatek and I are going to talk about some of those battles. But before we get there, John, two things. I'd like to have the audience hear a little bit about you, but also NFIB. You guys are fairly active. The one thing I remember, my first kind of knowledge of NFIB was back in the days of Hillary Care, when NFIB, contrary to almost every single other business group out there, came out in opposition to single-payer health plan. And you guys took a strong stand, and that's one of the things I really like about NFIB is that you're kind of like us. You're not beholden to the special interests. Small businesses in California have their backs up against the wall, and really we have nothing to lose but to fight and speak truth to power. So, John, a little bit about yourself and the NFIB, California.
Yeah, and it's great to see you, my friend. John, I mean, what you and HJTA do every day for taxpayers, the small business community thanks you. And I know we have a lot of crossover members as well. But aside from that, it's been such a great natural alliance between NFIB and Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. So thanks for having me on. Yeah, to be blunt, I mean, we were founded by a guy who was really frustrated that nobody was fighting for small business, a Californian in the South San Francisco area 80 years ago, who was a member of the U.S. Chamber, which is a great job fighting organization. But even back then, he said, I need an organization that's fighting for small, independent, privately held businesses. Created NFIB like an entrepreneur as a small little club in Burlingame, South San Francisco. Right. And over 80 years, John, it has become the largest small business group. We have about 14,000 members we serve here in California, about 350,000 across the nation. And the bottom line is our small business members tell us what's important to them and what to fight for, be it lower taxes for sure, fewer regulations, fewer frivolous lawsuits. And then, they told us back in 1993 when Hillary Care was introduced, this isn't going to work. The math doesn't pan out, and we need you to fight for us. And then when Obamacare came about, not only did we stand up and make noise, we were the lead plaintiff along with 27 other states that challenged the Obamacare in the United States Supreme Court. We fight vigorously. We carry a big stick, but we represent the little guy, little gal, and we're proud of that.
Yeah, I remember recently in Washington, D.C., when the progressives kind of had a chokehold on all three branches, the National Chamber of Commerce really had a falling out with the Republicans, and really the door was closed to the National Chamber of Commerce because of some of the positions they were taking. Now, the Chamber of Commerce here in California We actually get along very well with them. Alan Zarenberg, who recently passed away, was the president, and we agreed with them about 80% of the time, but we agreed with NFIB about 95% of the time, because really, it's one thing. I've heard it said one time. A legislator impressed me one time when he says, people say that I'm pro-business. That's not exactly true. I'm pro-free enterprise. And there is a shade of difference between free enterprise and business, because we have seen particularly large corporations use their power of their market share to squeeze out competitors. And also, some major corporations are adept at, they're at the table. I mean, they have the lobbyist, and they will cut their own deals and leave small businesses and citizen taxpayers by the wayside. So I'm really glad NFIB is out there, and you guys are doing a great job. I've got to believe. I know there are so many issues for you guys. I got to imagine you have to figure out what's the worst: the taxes, the regulation, or the unemployment insurance scandal. Of those three, which ones do you want to talk about first? We could spend 2 hours talking about the trials and tribulations of small business in California. So what's the worst thing right in front of your face right now, John?
Yeah, great question. Great question, John. I think you and we all can agree that I think the only deficit that California isn't facing is the only dearth is really the multitude of problems and challenges that face Main Street employers. That's the only deficit we're not facing right here. And at the end of the day, I think what I'm really finding from we're talking to small business owners, they just continue to have that high level of uncertainty. They don't understand what's around the bend. And I think right now, they are very concerned about the threats, to Prop 13. They really believe that is, and to your credit and Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association credit, John, I don't know where Prop 13 would be today, if it would be at all, without the fight that you put up. So when you talk about property taxes, 54% of our members rent their property, 40% own, 7% kind of have a blend. Here in California and nationally. But when they start to look at that last bastion of tax protection that is continued, that labor and progressives continue to try to poke a hole through, if not eliminate and throw in the trash can, they're scared. They're terrified of that. So Prop 13, and I know you've talked about ACA 13 and certainly other taxpayer protection things on the positive side coming up. That is an area where small business owners stand up. They're scared, they're uncertain, but they're hopeful Prop 13 will stay strong.
Yeah, I think, in terms of the core of Proposition 13, the core of Prop 13, of course, is the 1% rate limit, and then the limitation on annual increases in taxable value to 2% a year, with property being reassessed to full market value when it changes hands. And we can talk about that a little bit. But on all the metrics, and John, I'm sure you work this into your speeches, as do I. You stand in front of a group and you go through the metrics of California. Highest income tax rate in America at 13.3%. Highest state sales tax rate in America at 7.25%. And that's before all the add-ons that can kick it up to 10%. Highest gas tax in the nation. And even with Prop 13, we rank 14th out of 50 states in per capita property tax collections. California is not a low property tax state, but you mentioned one of the key drivers, one of the chief concerns for the small business community, and that is certainty and predictability. And that is the one thing that Prop 13 does, because with that 1% rate cap and the limitation on annual increases to taxable value, homeowners and small businesses can predict with absolute certainty what their future property taxes will be. And for the young homeowner, for the new entrepreneur, the last thing they need is to be taxed out of their place of business or their home by a property tax bill that's based on market value, not what they were willing to pay for it at the time they purchased it. So interesting metrics, interesting data you just gave me about how many people rent. And for renters, we hear this all the time too. Well, renters don't get any benefit from Prop 13. Well, guess again, because what happens when the
Triple net.
owners, when the owners flip, the property is reassessed to full market value, and that flows immediately to the tenants.
And then that flows immediately to the customers and the community, because they have no choice but to raise those prices or scale back. Either way, if that small business suffers, whether they rent or own, time and again, which is why I'm glad that you're fighting for it. We're continuing to fight for it. We're just urging all Californians to make sure we protect that very sacred law. Absolutely.
Yeah, the big fight we had on Prop 13 as it relates to business properties specifically was the infamous split roll proposal. This has been that age-old idea that business properties should pay more, and that Proposition 13 was intended to help just homeowners. Well, first of all, we know that that's not true because the ballot arguments made it very clear that Prop 13, the protections of Prop 13 would extend to business properties just like it would to homeowners. And everybody says, well, Prop 13 created a loophole for businesses. Well, that's not true, because since the mid-1800s, California has had what we call a unified roll, not a split roll, where all property is treated the same. And what that has done politically, John, is that it has either forced an alliance or created an alliance between homeowners and the business community. And, as Benjamin Franklin said, we either hang together, we hang separately. So this fight against split roll, and most recently it was Proposition 15. That was 2020, wasn't it? Was it Prop 15 2020, the latest split roll? Very, very difficult election cycle for conservatives.
Right.
In California, Trump was on the ballot. Trump was not generally well liked in California. All mailed ballots in the middle of a pandemic, and we defeated split roll. So I think, John, I don't want, knock on wood, I think we've kind of frozen split roll for maybe a few election cycles, but there are many other problems out there, aren't there?
No doubt about it. And I know, John, what we often talk about is this business exodus from California. And I know we may get to that a little bit further, but I mean, just take a look at this. The Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce did a study that found, again, lack of affordable housing being one of the top reasons businesses are fleeing to other states for more business-friendly policy. Even a company, we always talk about Texas and Florida. Of course, they have no state income tax, so those have been very attractive to people leaving California. And the Census Bureau has even found that to be the case. But I would say, even there's a group called Storage Cafe, which is kind of an organization that represents and does trends of moving companies and moving trends across the country. They're finding states like Idaho, Vermont, Montana are places where affordable housing, John,
right,
is a much more attractive. In fact, take Idaho, for example. California's housing costs are 76% higher than Idaho's.
Jeez.
So we just look at something like that and we think, gosh, and most of the people moving, or a lot of them, are these baby boomers looking to retire, but a lot of them are younger families. They're looking to start their family. So, and while there's a lot more associated with higher housing costs in the Golden State, or I think once again, hopeful Golden State,
yes.
Prop 13 is one of those things that is, if we see that dismantled, watch that number grow in terms of the costs and businesses fleeing. So we've got to keep protecting it. I know there's other issues, but man, I'm just so glad that we're out there. You're out there making that voice heard on that last bastion of tax protection.
Yeah, it's what Howard Jarvis intended was two things. His primary motivation was to make sure that the elderly would not be taxed out of their homes. His second objective was to slow down the growth and size of government. Now, Prop 13 is effective at the first, but quite frankly, and I have to admit, Prop 13 has not done much, if at all, on slowing down the size and growth of government, because no one single constitutional amendment can do that. It takes elected leadership. And elected leadership in California is now in a dismal state for anybody on the free enterprise business side of the ledger, which is why people have moved out. You know, we can, and you and I are kind of out of the same mold. We are pretty aggressive advocates for our organizations, but we're also rational, and we try to convince our political adversaries of the consequences of their policies. And I talk to Democrats who don't care that people are moving out. And I just learned that California, when Elon Musk moved to Texas, California lost $1 billion that year and will lose $1 billion a year for the foreseeable future. Can you,
wow, that's just mind-boggling.
That's one taxpayer. That's one. And as you point out, California is this high tax island surrounded by Nevada. Well, Texas is kind of far away, but other states are lowering their taxes. Arizona is on a path under, I think it's Governor Doug Ducey is on a path to slowly ratchet down their income tax to zero. And then in the Midwest, I went to high school in Iowa. Kim Reynolds, the governor of Iowa, has slowly reduced the income tax, and their revenues go up. And you talk to people about California. You're cutting your own throat, and they just, I don't know what it is. Many of them are openly part of this. What's the group called? The Democratic Socialists. I wish they would take a course in economics 101.
At what point does it wake up our policymakers, our progressive leaders in California, when they start to see in their own backyards these businesses leaving? Jonathan, in this past, 3 to 4 years, we've seen 11 to 12 Fortune 1000 companies leave California. And when people say, well, the big companies, are gone, who cares? But that trickles down to Main Street, those businesses that do business to business, those little communities that work with them, that rely on them. At the end of the day, again, that is a big impact. So you asked some other issues. I'll tell you, you mentioned unemployment insurance. Thank God, Governor Newsom tapped into some of his hopeful entrepreneurial logic, and vetoed a bill that would have extended unemployment insurance benefits to all striking workers in California. People who are unemployed people who should be getting unemployment insurance, at least reasonably, are those who have lost their job through no fault of their own. But John, this one would have extended this bill, SB 799, if it had been signed by the governor, would have given all striking workers, even two people in a break room who disagree with the quality of the cookies or the quality of the workplace. And we were told this by a Democrat member in the legislature, that would have been grounds for employees to strike and collect UI. And I'm sorry, if I last checked, John, the numbers better. Aren't we at about $18.5 billion owing the federal government for the UI trust fund already?
Yeah, it's massive. I think it may be higher. And what's funny is, during the pandemic, a lot of states had to borrow money to pay their unemployment insurance benefits, and that's understandable. But as we came out of the pandemic, all the other states paid off their debt to the federal government, except I think it was the Virgin Islands and either New York or Connecticut, one of those two states. But those amounts of money was like maybe 100 million, not much. But California's, I saw a chart. There's a chart floating out there of the amount of debt relative to all other states, and all the other states are zero. Virgin Islands is this little tiny line, and like Connecticut is a little bit higher.
Yeah.
And California is like at the ceiling. And At one time, we had $100 billion surplus, and the governor did not use that money to pay down that obligation. Now, for people who I'm not a real expert on unemployment insurance, John, so I may say something incorrect, but that is not a direct tax owed by taxpayers, but it's the employers that have to pay this tax as part of their payroll tax, which is another reason for a business person, a small business person, to look at it. I can move to Texas and my unemployment insurance premiums are going to be a fraction of what I have to pay here in California. Is that not right?
Absolutely. And if we don't nip this in the bud soon, employers' payroll taxes per employee are going to be upwards of $21 and then double every year for the next several years, up to an amount of $434 per employee in the workplace. Now, for some people, that may not seem like a lot, but Jonathan, that is a lot of money for small business owners.
Yes.
And it's that hit on Main Street where they think, like, what I heard a small business member tell me down in Southern California was, look, I didn't get us into this mess. Why am I the one expected to get us out of this mess? They're the ones who should be fixing it. And they had the opportunity, like you said, and they did nothing when we were in the black.
Yeah. For the small business person, especially in any business that's got really thin margins, you take like a grocery store, pretty thin margins, 3-4%, that and heavy intensive on the employment side, that hurts. And what does that do? That raises the cost of the goods, as you said, and that goes down to consumers. One of the things when I refer to business taxpayers, and then I often refer to citizen taxpayers, but lately I've also been referring to citizen taxpayers / consumers, because as these costs get built in to the goods and services we buy, that falls directly on consumers, and it's the middle class. If you're a high tech AI specialist who's making $500,000 a year and you're 24 years old, you don't care. If you're a high-tech billionaire, you don't care. If you own if you own massive amounts of property, or you're a Hollywood star or an entertainer or professional basketball player, you don't care what unemployment insurance is. But, for the middle class, and this is where California is really dropping the ball. It really bugs me. It bugs me a lot that all the progressives talk about income inequality. We need to do something to address income inequality. Too big of a gap between the very wealthy and the very poor. Well, where is income inequality the worst? It's in progressive cities, and San Francisco is Exhibit A. Very few people in the middle class in San Francisco. You either can afford to live there, or you're on the street, or very poor and on welfare. And so where's the middle class moving to? To red states. So it's
and ironically, the proponents in the legislature do respect the governor as well. The folks who are proposing these asinine policies with this income inequality rooted in it are people who are coming from these very, very have versus have not, or perceived communities versus, I don't see many of these proponents coming from the Central Valley, from the deep in the Inland Empire. These are people from well-to-do communities with that income inequality, proposing policies that will just make things that much worse.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. You mean the average middle class person isn't going to have dinner at the French Laundry? Is that what you're saying?
Hold on, let me get on the line. I'll make a reservation.
As long as you're paying, I'm care.
Paying. Let me see what Alice Waters has cooking. Jonathan, another issue that I'd love to talk about, because it is adding insult to injury, or I probably should say injury to insult these days, is crime. Retail theft. You ask what I'm hearing almost hourly from our NFIB members, and actually we're part of a coalition, Californians Against Retail and Residential Theft, which is focused on this. But I will tell you, retail crime and retail theft is a problem, and it is getting worse, and it is getting violent. And just so you know, our policymakers in Sacramento have had opportunities to fix this, time and again, and they have passed zero bills to even minimally address this. So
Right.
I'd love to talk to you a little bit about that, because
Sure.
it is a
Please
growing
do.
problem, and
Please
it
do.
is making bad matters terribly worse in California. Just to give you some idea here, the National Retail Federation, just on a national level, reports inventory shrinkage, and shrinkage is basically loss that's due to theft and fraud in the workplace.
Right.
It is at a 5-year all-time high of 1.6%. And with about 60% increase in losses over the past 5 years. Just to give you an idea, in 2021, there was $93.9 billion nationally reported in retail theft, small, medium, large. In 2022, $112.1 billion. This number is getting worse, but what we're finding here in California is policymakers that are doing nothing to address it. Zero to address it. We even saw, for example, and it's not just, by the way, small businesses, John. It's not. It's people at their front doors. We have seen more than 260 million packages from these porch piracies been, at about $19.5 billion in cost, packages being stolen from people's front yards. But the one that really shocked me is catalytic converter thefts. I will tell you this, in 2018, there were 1,300 catalytic converter thefts. In 2021, 52,000. That's a 1,200% increase. So what we're finding from small business owners, though, is they're not getting nearly enough financial support with law enforcement locally. But the big root of it is Prop 47. It's this measure that basically voters approved in 2014 that increases the value of a property from $450 to $950 to be counted as a felony. So guess what? Shoplifters are just thumbing their nose at the law and walking out of those stores. Big problem.
As it relates to the catalytic converters, didn't the state or some plaintiffs' lawyers sue Hyundai because they made it too easy for the car to steal? What sense does that make?
It's crazy.
It's crazy. You're suing the car company because, you just made your car too easy to steal. That is the stupidest thing. I would use an expletive right now, but I've got to be FCC compliant. But that is bat guano crazy to place the blame on the car company because their cars are being stolen.
That is almost like telling John Kupal, the wonderful chocolate chip cookie maker with his bakery, that it was your fault for putting those deliciously smelling cookies at the front of your store near the walkway instead of keeping them in the back. Shame on you, John, because you made it really easy for people to take those awesome cookies. Shame on you. How could you do that? And not only that, shame on you, you're going to be sued because you have offended the consumer community. Put them in jeopardy. Oh my God. Oh my God.
Well, the other concern for your small business people, your retail theft, is as these people come in and they raid the stores. Number one, those are dangerous, violent situations, and the stores have to be very careful about confronting people because they can be sued, and that adds to the liability insurance. I did see a very satisfying video yesterday of a young man who grabbed a bunch of stuff, and he is trying to escape the store, and the security guard is there, and he's got a shopping cart in between this thief and the door, and he's moving it to keep this guy from moving, and then a store clerk takes a glass Coke bottle and throws it and hits the guy on the head and knocks him out. And I'm going, that's poetic justice, but that will probably end up as a lawsuit. And
it will.
That's unfortunate. I think, if I were czar of the universe, I'd say you got a free range on those people.
Now, and to his credit, the governor did allocate some extra dollars, 100 million plus for local law enforcement. But we need much more than that. We need to address Prop 47, if not completely fix it. Take a look at these numbers, John. Property crimes up in Sacramento, where we spend a lot of our time. It was up this past year, 16.9%. Los Angeles, 9.1%. Long Beach, 9.8%. San Jose, 17.2%. And San Francisco, 4.4%. I think 4.4 is a lot higher these days, but we're seeing numbers up. And the problem is with the small businesses, as you talk about, we talk about, they're not getting any attention here. There's all of this focus on organized retail crime and they are terrible. Don't get me wrong, with Saks Fifth Avenue, Nordstrom, the big stores, right? Even the Best Buys. But, what we're finding from the small business owners is these are the more pervasive, commonplace crimes are these shopliftings that are, these people are walking in, walking out, thumbing their nose at the owner. And here's the bigger problem we've told the governor's team and the attorney general is that this is going to become the wild, wild west. To your point about throwing that bottle, now we're finding people who have mortgaged their homes, who have pretty much taken out every loan they can for their very small retail store or liquor store or a convenience store, you name it, hardware store. And this is all they have. So when they see somebody stealing from them now, as like we saw in the civil unrest in the early 1990s, we're seeing especially business owners in economically disadvantaged neighborhoods taking the law into their own hands. So we're now making a bad matter terribly worse, and it's becoming the Wild West because our policymakers are allowing it to become the Wild West.
That's true. I do remember during the LA riots, I think there was a Korean grocery store that they wanted to stay open, and they did. And they served because remember, when a store closes, that's not only bad for the store owner, it's bad for the community. You're taking a neighborhood, someone who services the neighborhood, services the community, you're taking them off the map. And I remember this store, they literally had a guy on the roof with a semi-automatic weapon, and they put cars around the front parking lot kind of as a barricade, and they wanted to stay open, and they were letting people in one at a time to so they could buy groceries, buy milk, eggs. And it shouldn't come to that, John.
It shouldn't.
It shouldn't come to that. And that's not law enforcement. I mean, that was a one-off event. And quite frankly, I know a lot of the good district attorneys in California, and they're frustrated because they have to apply these laws. The cops are frustrated. And so what we really need is we need better laws, repealing Prop 47, and then start associating consequences to theft, because when people think there are no consequences, guess what? They get away with it.
And there are reasonable policies that have been introduced. And again, I think at the end of the day, this is going to have to be decided by the people at the ballot box, because we have 17 bills were introduced last session. 2 years ago, I should say, in 2022. Not one of the 17 moved forward. And there were bills authored by Democrats and Republicans that included, John, both accountability and penalties, as well as diversion and rehabilitation programs. Not one moved forward. This year, the only bill out of about 8 or 9 that moved out of legislative committee, was one that was a study bill by a former deputy sheriff, Juan Alanis, from Fresno, that was just a study bill. They could have looked like heroes with just a study bill moving forward, and that got held back. So we don't think our policymakers are going to make any difference here. They're hugging the criminal more than they are the small business owner and the person at the front porch getting attacked. And so I think what we're going to find is there have been some efforts, some initiative, I should say, pun intended, by the district attorneys, by the retailers, and by others in business to take something to the ballot next year, hopefully, if signatures can be gathered. But we can't let this be lying in the hands of our progressive legislators as long as we have a progressive legislature. It's got to be the people. And the people, Jonathan, are fed up. It's time to change.
I think so. You and I, given the positions that we have, often have access to polling, and we're seeing a lot of frustration out there. You and I recognize that the makeup of the California legislature is not reflected in what average Californians think. Now, average Californians are not super conservative. This isn't Mississippi. This isn't Alabama. But Californians tend to be socially moderate. But on fiscal issues, they tend to be far more purple than they are blue. And so this I think opens up some opportunities for the business groups and taxpayers to get some progress on this, and that includes NFIB. And before I forget, believe it or not, we only have about 10 minutes left. I mean, it's always fun talking to you, John. The time just flies. But I do want to remind people that NFIB is a membership organization, and John, we're a membership organization. You said earlier that there's probably a lot of crossover, and I think there is. But if people want, if someone's a small business person, how do they get a hold of you? How do they join NFIB California? Because I do believe your organization's like mine. The strength in numbers. We may not be the most powerful organization of trial lawyers or major corporations, but we have strength in numbers. How does a small business person take advantage of becoming a member of NFIB?
Well, I appreciate that. Yes. Well, anybody who's interested, if you're a small business owner, whether you have one employee, whether you're a sole proprietor, you've got 10, 15, 30, if you're a privately held small business owner and you feel that you need that advocacy, in addition to Howard Jarvis' team and the taxpayer front, you should think about NFIB. And you can find us at nfib.com. nfib.com. There is a California page that talks about a lot of the things we're doing here, but we're also very active and aggressive at the federal level. We're fighting to make sure that we can, to you one of these, you'll like this, at the federal level, we're making sure that we can make the Main Street Tax Certainty Act permanent, John. That will make sure that 20% business deduction for small businesses doesn't expire in 2025. That otherwise is going to be a significant tax increase for small businesses who are going to see 20% higher taxes each session. So we're involved at the federal level, at the state level, nfib.com. But it's a place where small business owners can feel like they know that they are not alone, that they're getting the help they need, and that we're fighting together, and together with Howard Jarvis and others. So making sure that's being done.
It's all about coalitions, particularly if we're going to move the ball forward. We saw this with the proposal to split the tax roll. Even though our members are mostly homeowners, we do have owners of mom and pop apartment buildings as well. But the coalitions are going to be very, very important. And I know that sometimes when people listen to this podcast, John and I have a good time. We try to bring some levity to it. And when Susan and I do this podcast, we try to bring some levity to it. Even though the metrics are grim for California, I do think it's very important for people not to give up on California. I know a lot of people have, but there are a lot of us who still believe that California is worth fighting for. And we just need to get people more engaged. John, you and I have work cut out for us in continuing to educate voters and citizens, and small business people are busy. I mean, running a small business is super time consuming, and they just don't have time to engage in all these issues. But the one thing you do that I think is really good is when I've approached you on a major issue, something that, you're obviously naturally aligned with us, but you say, I have to check with my members, and you send out a survey to your members and you get, 95% of them agree with us. Well, we kind of predicted that, but you go out and you make sure that you give your members an avenue for feedback on the policies that you engage in. And I think that's very, very commendable.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think that's so important. I think it's a lost, dying breed. Jarvis does this. You guys are doing this. We do it. But I think fewer and fewer organizations are allowing their members to make the decisions for them. And I think that's incredibly important, especially when small business owners and taxpayers don't feel like they're being heard in Sacramento. It's funny. We talk about levity, a couple of stories. I remember being up in Northern California. I think it was in Redding, visiting a guy who owned a machine shop, a little small machine shop. And I said, sir, with the taxes, the regulations, the lawsuits, the mandates, sir, it must feel like you're swimming upstream. He grabbed me by the shoulder and he says, son, we're swimming upstream in peanut butter. I said, well, that's, and it being around us this time of this podcast being around Halloween, I am thinking of a lot of Reese's candy bars, but it's a visual. And then another gentleman I saw in front of the Capitol recently, I was talking to, I said, he looked at me, he said, you know how you start a small business in California, don't you? And I said, no, tell me. He said, oh, you open up a big business and just wait. You just let nature take its course.
Yeah, I remember that I've heard some horror stories of a guy who owned a machine, automotive parts, custom auto parts
Hmm.
in Los Angeles, East LA, when and provided employment for a lot of people. He wanted to expand his shop. The permitting was ridiculous. So he was going to a conference on the East Coast, and he had a layover in Las Vegas from LA to New York. And he had a layover in Vegas. He had a couple hours to kill. He goes into the Vegas employment development office. He walks out with a building permit. It was a conditional permit. But they found out he was a business person in California, and it was like, alarm goes off. Three people practically attack him. What can we do? What can we do? What can we do for you? Instead of having doors slammed in his face, other states are just other states have the mentality where that profit is not a dirty word, and they attract business, and the states reap the benefits of having more taxpayers.
And I think because people have the logic to understand, and we saw with the pandemic, what happens when small businesses shut down. It's the rising tide mentality, John. You know this. So, when small businesses are shut down and depleted, so are is the tax base that they contribute to. So is the money that goes to roads, highways, schools. Right. Gosh, even some union-related causes. But at the end of the day, it's mostly these public services, healthcare, education, streets, schools, our communities. But when small businesses and the business community and taxpayers thrive, the opposite happens. We can see robust support for and responsible spending always for those public services that are important to us. But people in other states realize that are the more friendly states, when we can help those businesses thrive and create jobs and contribute to our tax base, guess what? We will kick butt too. So,
Exactly.
So exactly. We got to get that into the mind. And I think going into the 2024 election, your listeners understand that a couple things: hold your local electeds accountable. If you're a small business owner, bring them to their store, bring their staff members to your store, let them see how you operate in their own backyard. And then most importantly, looking ahead, let them know that you're holding them accountable on election day next year. And so are many others. That's a really important thing going into this next year.
That's absolutely true. Now, we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to touch on another issue very, very briefly, which does impact small businesses, and that is the HJT effort to repeal the death tax, the ability of parents and grandparents to convey real property to their children or grandchildren without triggering a big tax cut. There was an initiative called Prop 19 on the ballot that severely restricted the ability to pass property along to children and grandchildren without triggering that reassessment. And in fact, small businesses, privately held real estate business properties, completely lost that ability. So if you're a small business and you wanted to hand your property, a small cafe or a muffler shop, to your son or a grandson, it used to be you could do that without triggering a big tax increase for the next generation. This is a way to protect intergenerational wealth. That was taken away, and we're trying to restore that protection. And so for people who are interested in that, can go to repealthedeathtax.com, repealthedeathtax.com. We're currently collecting signatures right now. So we have reached out to homeowners, obviously, and owners of small apartment buildings, but any small business, as John can attest, many of your members would like to pass along their business to their children and grandchildren.
Absolutely. And this death tax, this estate tax, is just as I hear from many small business owners and others in the community, it just makes a very, very sad situation that much more sad and difficult and traumatic, right? Yeah. So for people who their very livelihood is reliant upon this being passed along, it just is crushing for them. So you absolutely encouraging and joining, and I'm so glad that you are all pushing that one, and we encourage everybody to be very involved in that. And it's you said the website again is
repealthedeathtax.com is the website.
Yeah.
So, well, John, this This has gone by very, very quickly. I really want to thank you for all people who are listening to this, who are owners of small businesses. Please go to NFIB website, and they're led by the state director of NFIB, the California State Director, John Capotak, a good friend of mine. He and I have been in the trenches fighting for many, many years, and I think that's going to do it for us. My name is John Kupal. I'm president of the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. Go to hjta.org, hjta.org. If you are not a member of the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association and you want to keep your house, please join us. We're a membership organization, as is NFIB, and we didn't even talk about a lot of the stuff in the ballot. So we're going to have you on again, because this has been lots of fun, and that's going to do it for us. Everybody take care, and we'll see you next week.